All right, guys, so we got a new investigation out here from Israeli Channel 13 exposing how the Joe Biden administration never once tried to pressure Israel to get a ceasefire in Gaza throughout the entirety of the 14 or so months that he presided over this genocide. So their headline here from Dropsite News is Biden officials admit they never pressured Israel for a ceasefire as Israeli leaders boast of playing Washington. So they got a quote here from the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Herzog, who said this: God did the state of Israel a favor that Biden was the president during this period. We fought in Gaza for over a year, and the administration never came to us and said ceasefire now. It never did. And that's not to be taken for granted. So obviously, this Israeli ambassador is portraying this in a positive light, right? He's saying, thank you, Joe Biden, for being the ardent Zionist that you are. Thank you for allowing us to kill tens of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. Thank you for allowing us to bomb mosques and churches and schools and hospitals and refugee camps and aid workers and journalists with complete and total immunity. Thank you for giving us cover on the world stage, for attacking the United Nations and the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Thank you for allowing us to fulfill our genocidal ambitions without doing a single goddamn thing. Not even just not cutting off the weapons to Israel, not even just the diplomatic cover, but not even asking for it behind the scenes. That's what he's saying here. They never once tried to pressure Israel to use any leverage whatsoever to get a ceasefire. Now, I've often said the main difference between like the Democratic Party's platform versus a Republican Party, or more specifically Biden and Trump, when it comes to this specific issue, the main difference is that the Joe Biden administration was trying to sell a narrative that, sure, at the same time that we're supporting and arming and funding and giving diplomatic cover for this genocide, we also believe in humanitarianism. We also believe in human rights. We believe in international law. We believe in the rules of war. They were trying to say both of those things at the same time, right? That's the main difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, is that Donald Trump doesn't even bother with the pretend finger wagging or the pretend, temporary sanctions on a few handpicked settlers, or the pretend red lines. Like if you remember Joe Biden's fake red line when it came to invading Rafah that he did nothing about when Israel violated it. That's the difference between these two guys, is that Joe Biden's administration was trying to maintain this veneer that we actually care about international law and human rights while we're supporting, arming, and funding a genocide, right? Now, this was coming at a time where not only Joe Biden himself, not only his, administration ghouls like Matthew Miller and Antony Blinken and Ned Sullivan and the rest of them, but also the U.S. media, right? And also much of the Democratic Party, including even people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, all of them were trying to sell the narrative that Joe Biden is working tirelessly, Kamala Harris is working tirelessly for a ceasefire, right? It's not that we agree with everything Israel's doing. It's just that our hands are tied, right? What are we supposed to do? We're powerless. We're just simple bystanders throughout this entire process. That's what they were trying to sell to the American people. And what this, along with just basic reality to anybody who has been paying attention for the last 18, 19 months, what this exposes is that was all a complete and total fucking lie. A complete lie. They had every opportunity in the world to end the genocidal carnage in Gaza, and they actively made a decision not to do that. So we continue here because we got more in this report to get to. They say a sweeping Israeli Channel 13 investigation has exposed the Biden administration's complicity in Israel's 19-month war on Gaza. 9 top Biden officials acknowledged avoiding real pressure on Israel even as the death toll surpassed 30,000. Israeli leaders openly bragged that they dragged out the war, playing for time until Donald Trump's return, which is what they ended up getting. Former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Ambassador Tom Nides, and others defended their unwavering support for Israel, even as they admitted enabling a campaign that one U.S. aide described as killing and destroying for the sake of killing and destroying. So on that point here, we got the full quote. This is from Ilan Goldenberg, who again was a senior national security aide, who said this: If they're never going to do this, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. Hamas is still going to control Gaza. You're just killing and destroying for the sake of killing and destroying. You're not building an alternative. They also say U.S. officials pushed a post-war plan modeled on the anti-ISIS campaign, proposing that Arab states temporarily secure Gaza, but Netanyahu blocked it, refusing any role for the Palestinian Authority. Now, this is wild, guys, because many Palestinians, I think to some extent at least rightfully so, view the Palestinian Authority as largely being complicit with the occupation of the West Bank, right? So it's not even clear whether or not or how many Palestinians in Gaza would be okay with the Palestinian Authority taking over control there. But even with that, even with this entity that, again, is largely subservient to the Israeli government, that still wasn't enough for Benjamin Netanyahu, right? He wanted to take control for himself of the Gaza Strip. Now, furthering on that, they say far-right Israeli ministers Itamar Ben-Gvir, who we just talked about a couple days ago as he was in the United States, and Bezalel Smotrich openly pushed for reoccupying Gaza and rebuilding settlements. Netanyahu refused to advance alternatives, keeping the door open to their demands. And what do we have now? Well, now that the Trump administration has come to power, we have Benjamin Netanyahu openly saying things like I talked about a few days ago, that even in a situation where Hamas lays down their arms, all of the remaining hostages are returned to Israel, even in that situation, Israel is still going to remain in Gaza to push forward with the Trump plan, right? Now, what is the Trump plan? The Trump plan is full-blown ethnic cleansing, or in the dystopian way that they phrase it, voluntary migration to surrounding countries, right? That's the Trump plan, is to expel the population of Gaza to surrounding countries, to force them out, and then for either Israel or the United States directly, in Trump's words, to own the Gaza Strip, right? So that's the reality of what we have now. So to anybody who's been, I think, in good faith paying attention to what Israel has been doing on the ground in Gaza, as well as what top Israeli officials have been saying they want to do in the future in Gaza, this has been clear for a long time, right? This didn't sneak up on anybody that this was going to inevitably be the plan. But if you pointed this out a year or so ago, that Israel wants to take over Gaza, right? They want to conquer Gaza and expel the Palestinian population there and make life impossible for the Palestinians in Gaza. If you pointed it out a year ago, as we did and many others did, then you were called a raging anti-Semite, right? You were called delusional for believing in such a thing, even though clearly that's the reality that they were working towards. Now, next point here, they repeat the quote from Michael Herzog, the Israeli ambassador here, praising Joe Biden for his endless support for Israel. But they also add on, Biden aides privately admitted that Netanyahu was dragging out the war, saying, quote, he's undercutting it every step of the way. All the security people are coming out and saying it. He also revealed that there were internal discussions in Washington about Biden giving a speech to pressure Israel politically, possibly triggering new elections there, but Biden backed off. So, again, a lot of this is stuff that it's like, this was clear the entire time. I guess now some of these people feel comfortable talking about it now that they're out of power, I guess. But like, this was never really difficult to figure out, that Benjamin Netanyahu was dragging on the war, that he was extending it, that he wasn't really interested in securing a ceasefire or a peace deal. Of course he wasn't. He was sabotaging it every step of the way, right? And to Joe Biden, even though he knew that behind the scenes, he wasn't even willing to give a fucking speech. Not even a speech. We're not talking about cutting off the weapons, right? We're not talking about imposing sanctions as we should do on Israel. We're not talking about, allowing the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice to move forward with their cases against Israel. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about a fucking speech. And even that was a step too far for Joe Biden. Wasn't even willing to apply that level of power, not to mention actually using the leverage that he has at his disposal, being the main arms supplier and top ally of Israel. Now, the next point that they have here, U.S. covered for Israeli war crimes and blocked an aid report. So this is just grotesque, guys. They say State Department advisor Stacey Gobert resigned after being cut out of the process of drafting a legally required arms compliance report. The final version cleared Israel of violating U.S. law despite overwhelming evidence of aid obstruction. Gilbert called it shocking in its mendacity, adding, everyone knows that it's not true. So even as settlers looted Gaza-bound trucks and Israel blocked humanitarian aid, Biden certified compliance and the weapons kept flowing. Because we've said this many times before, but The weapons that Biden and that now Trump are sending to Israel are totally illegal, not just under international law because you're arming and funding a genocide, but even under U.S. law, right? It is illegal under U.S. law for the United States to send weapons to a country that is blocking aid, right? It is illegal for us to send weapons to a country that we know is using those weapons to commit gross human rights violations or war crimes, right? That's illegal. Now, what the Biden administration did here is they basically rigged this report, and Joe Biden signed off on it saying, no, Israel's not blocking the aid. No, they're not using these weapons to commit war crimes, even though there's overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And you even had many Israeli officials bragging about the fact that they were restricting aid from getting into Gaza, saying it's part of their strategy. Now, again, fast forward to today, and what have we seen? Well, since March 2nd, since Israel blew up the most recent ceasefire, they have totally cut off all humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza. There's been no food, no medicine, nothing that has gotten into Gaza for almost 2 months now at this point. We now have dozens of children who are starving to death as a result of this. And what happens? Well, the U.S. continues the flow of weapons. Now, next point here. Number 4. Netanyahu sabotaged captive release talks to prolong the war. It's like, I wish that some of this was revelatory. I wish that some of this was not obvious the entire way through. But the reality is that this report is just explaining everything that we've been talking about for a year and a half, that the U.S. has been lying about for a year and a half. So some of the details on this, they say Biden officials revealed that Netanyahu deliberately tanked negotiations. If only somebody had figured that out a while ago, fearing that a deal would force him to end the war. They say American-Israeli hostage Hirsch Goldberg Poland was scheduled for release the day he was executed. Amos Hochstein confirmed, quote, there's no doubt that those hostages would be alive if Netanyahu hadn't sabotaged and tanked negotiations. They say Netanyahu's public campaign to retain control over Gaza's Philadelphia corridor was viewed by Biden officials as a smokescreen to kill the deal. Guys, again, this is no secret that the priority from Israel was never returning their hostages. They could have done that dozens of times at this point. Even the most recent ceasefire negotiation that they blew up and refused to move on to phase 2, that outlined exactly how Israel, if they followed along with the originally agreed upon framework, they could have gotten all of the remaining hostages, alive and dead, back from Gaza to Israel. We've had these deals on the table over and over and over again. And over again, Netanyahu has sabotaged them. Again, because he doesn't give a shit about getting the Israeli hostages back. That's the reality. He does not give a single solitary shit. What he cared about was prolonging the genocide so that he could keep himself in a position of power. So that he could keep this going and prolong it, I guess, to the point where Trump comes back into office and then we can fully expel the Palestinian population from Gaza. And this is also coming, keep in mind, with the context of Israel killing their own hostages. At this point, it's estimated that they've killed dozens of their own hostages, including in that one circumstance that we covered where they were speaking in Hebrew and trying to wave a white t-shirt, and they were still killed by Israeli forces. Many of the places that Israel has been bombing in Gaza, they've struck some of the places where the hostages are being kept, killing them. So at this point, we're talking about dozens of those kinds of situations. So the notion that this was ever really about prioritizing getting the hostages back, it's just bullshit. It's complete and utter bullshit. Now, final point here. They say Biden backed Israel even as after Netanyahu publicly undermined and insulted him. So Biden once told Netanyahu he was full of shit and hung up on the phone mid-call. But as Ambassador Tom Nides put it, quote, Biden saw Netanyahu as a manipulator, a magician, but he stood by him through the end. So, guys, it's not even as though the Biden administration or then Kamala's candidacy that they could make the argument that, well, I disagree with what Israel's doing, but we can't really do anything about it because it's a massive political liability and we'll lose the election if we don't stand by Israel. They can't even make that argument because it's not true, right? We had the polling data on this, that a vast majority of the Democratic Party base wanted a ceasefire in Gaza. Not only that, but a vast majority supported an arms embargo of Israel. The politically smart thing to do, the politically popular thing to do ahead of the election was to call for a full arms embargo on Israel, to cut off the weapons, to force a ceasefire to happen. And they still chose to potentially sacrifice their chances of winning the election against Trump on behalf of Benjamin Netanyahu and his genocidal mayhem inside of Gaza. That's the decision that they made. Now, we've talked about some of these instances before, but just as a reminder, it's not as if we haven't seen U.S. presidents exert leverage over Israel when they want to pressure them to do something, right? This is, I think, one of the first presidencies that we've seen, maybe outside of Trump, where a U.S. president doesn't even acknowledge that he has this sort of power, right? So the most famous example is Ronald Reagan, where back in the 1980s, when Israel was bombing inside of Lebanon, he used the word Holocaust with an Israeli prime minister. So during the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, Reagan wrote in his diary, "I was angry. I told the prime minister that it had to stop or our entire future relationship was endangered. I used the word Holocaust deliberately and said the symbol of his war was becoming a picture of a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off. 20 minutes later, he called and told me that he would order an end to the barrage and pled for our continued friendship." So, a conservative, right-wing, Republican President Reagan got on the phone with an Israeli prime minister as they were bombing Lebanon, and he compared what they were doing to the Holocaust. He said, "You guys are creating a picture where this war that you're waging is shown as a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off." And he said, "Stop immediately, or it's going to endanger the future relationship between the U.S. and Israel." And what happened as a result of just a simple phone call there, just threatening to use the leverage that the U.S. has over Israel? 20 minutes. 20 minutes is what it took for him to stop the bombing. So, there is no pretending here that Biden was powerless, that he couldn't immediately, within one day, within one fucking phone call, have ended this genocide. He absolutely could have. He chose not to. So I'll leave you guys off with that. I wish this was all new revelatory information that we just found out about, but it's not, right? This is just describing what we have relentlessly covered for the last 18, 19 months of this genocide. This was never difficult to figure out. If I knew it, if you guys knew it, then Biden was aware of all of this. The Democratic Party was aware of all of this. The U.S. media was aware of all of this, and they just fucking lied. So they are just as complicit in everything that has happened inside of Gaza, in everything that is happening inside of the West Bank, as Benjamin Netanyahu is himself.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying